Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Alison Mackay.
Hello, Richard Morecroft.
It's lovely to see you there. And as many people will know, but some may not, you and I are partners. So this is an interview with a very slightly different dynamic. But your exhibition is entitled Same, but Different at Project Gallery 90 in Sydney. And let's go to that title first of all. What is the same and what is different?
Well, I suppose the same but different refers to the whole show, which arguably contains paintings that are both what you might call still life paintings and also abstract paintings. You know, we like to label things in terms of genres in art. So although we do call them still life and abstract paintings, for me, because of the process and the way all of the paintings are really, for me, concerned with paint, that's their main subject. It means for me that the paintings, whether they're still life or abstract, are the same, although they are arguably also different.
So they're almost defined by their commonality, the commonality of the way in which you use paint.
They are, yeah, because ultimately that is what really interests me in making a painting. You know, whether it's a painting about an object or whether it's a painting about an emotion or a landscape or a person's face, to me, the primary subject matter of any painting is paint.
Well, let's have a look at what you've done with paint. First of all, in the works which, as you've said, people would refer to as still life works, and you have painted predominantly still life works for many years, a couple of decades or so now. What is the attraction for you of that format of still life?
I have painted still life for quite a long time now. It's where I started. And I have stayed there, although during that time I have also taken side trips off into landscape and portraiture and now abstract, because I find as I paint more, in fact, as I was painting the still lifes, I was finding that I was drawn more and more to small passages in each of the paintings that I could see were actually paintings in their own right, despite the fact that they were actually quite abstract. So that started to lead me into developing that actually a bit more.
Let's have a look at some of those still life works in this exhibition. And first of all, what would you say that you look for in the composition or in the elements of a still life painting?
I've got to be interested by it. And I suppose also eventually when it gets to the stage of being a painting on a wall in a show, I'd like to think that the viewer is also going to be interested by it. So I like it to have a level of the slightly unusual that perhaps makes you say, you know, what's that doing in there? So ultimately, it needs to be interesting.
Well, I guess there are certainly works where there are elements of what perhaps might be regarded as traditional or conventional in still life, flowers, for example. But in a work like Bottles and Banksias, yes, there are flowers, but there are also a very solidly painted pair of secateurs down there, cutting implements. With a work like Gin and Banksias, again, we've got the flowers, we've got a glass component, but we've also got some quite powerful scissors. So do you see these as slightly deliberately unsettling elements?
Well, I hope they're a little bit unsettling. I've been painting flowers for probably the last 5 years or so, particularly since about 5 years ago we moved and we made a new garden. And so I have been taking flowers out of the garden. The problem with that for me is that they're often just too pretty. You know, they're beautiful things in their own right. They're already gorgeous. What am I going to add? So in making a painting that has flowers in them, I feel that I need to move it away from that a little bit to add something that I suppose juxtaposes, is a counterpoint to the beauty of the flowers. And so that's where we get into the solidity of the glass bottles or the sharpness, the cuttiness of the knives and the secateurs and the scissors.
There's also a sense of perhaps absurdism, almost verging on surrealism, with works like Yellowfish in Glasses or Chops in Glass. The juxtapositions are pretty unexpected.
Look, I suppose they are. For me, it never seemed that absurd, I have to say, and I'm not quite sure what that says about me. But I've always loved reflective surfaces and transparent surfaces and refractive surfaces. You know, when you look at a glass and you put something in it, immediately things start to break up. And that's something that really interests me about an image. So, you know, I love doing refractive substances or surfaces. I love doing things like meat and fish. So it was almost inevitable that the two would come together eventually. And that may end up with what people coming from the outside might think of as quite surreal. But to me, it was actually kind of a logical progression.
You mentioned earlier the importance of the use of paint and the attraction of paint for you in the creation of the works. Some of the works have particularly strong use of paint, apparently with palette knife or even quite large brush. Is that palette knife in still life combination a new direction for you?
Yes, I have started using the palette knife more. And in fact, as I was starting to make the abstract works, that was really where I started to get to know the palette knife a bit better, actually, as much for taking off paint as for putting it on. And it then began to find its way into the still life paintings, partly because the still life paintings were getting a bit bigger. So a palette knife was a great way of covering area quite quickly. But also, I think I was deliberately trying to move away from the finicky and the too controlled. I was trying to introduce an element, in fact, of lack of control, but something that removed some of the familiar control that I had. And so, I suppose, shook things up a little bit in the paintings.
Almost made the painting itself a little bit dangerous in its unpredictability.
Yeah, it does, because things happen that you can't control. And the question then is, do I want to correct it? Or do I want to say, well, actually, I quite like that and I'm going to leave it? It's something that a lot of the time, the marks that occur are not marks that you can deliberately make. They are marks that are made by chance, and then you get to decide whether you like them or not.
So going back to that relationship with paint, which you were referring to before, those marks, those happenstances, which happen as a corollary of what you're doing with the paint, what does that say about your relationship with the paint?
It says that I adore the paint, for a start, which I really do. But that the paint is a really active component, one of the most active components in the making of these paintings, which in a way sounds really obvious. Of course it is, it's the main component. But actually what paint does, and specifically what oil paint does, is something that is, you know, it's a really active component in the making and the process of all of these paintings.
The colours in many of these works are often really very intense. For example, yellow oysters. How do you actually decide on your colour and palette components?
It actually varies. I mean, a lot of the time in the still life works, there is a basis in reality. They're not exact because I like to give myself a bit of room to move. So I normally get to about 3/4 of the way through a painting and I realise that I've painted myself into a bit of a corner, and then I need to find a way of getting out of it. And sometimes it will involve a change in the composition, and sometimes it will involve changes in the colour. So, you know, the painting kind of starts to dictate to me what colours I should be using, I guess.
There's one large work with minimal colour, but great strength in the work, titled Dark Places. Can you describe how you set up the situation for painting each of these individual 9 works that then have made up this large multi-panelled work?
So I have a little box. I have a small box that I've constructed in my studio, which is lined with black material. And so I construct the still life arrangements for these paintings in that, and then I have a lovely light that I shine on them, which picks up the really lovely shiny bits of, say, the colanders or the tongs or the knives. So yeah, they're little moments of brightness in the midst of darkness.
We'll come back to still life again shortly, but let's move to some of those abstract works. as we were discussing a little earlier, are a large part of the exhibition. What, in a broad sense, first of all, do you feel that you're exploring with these abstract works?
Ultimately, I think I am exploring paint once again. It kind of comes back to paint every time for me. But in a broader way, I'm exploring a variety of new processes, so slightly different processes just to what we normally refer to as the look and put in still life. You know, you look at what's in front of you and you put the mark on the painting. This is much more about a process of putting marks down and building up something of a painting, and then allowing the painting to have a life of its own and dictate where it goes. I have no idea of what the painting is going to come out like. I need to begin to make marks in order to build something up, and then sometimes actually take it down again, to start to take things out as much as put them in at a later stage. So it's quite a different process to the still life process. But once again, it is really concerned with paint, how paint goes on, how it's used to describe things, whether, you know, whether it's actually a physical thing that you're describing or an emotion that you're describing.
Many artists tend to move to perhaps a tighter focus of either subject matter or painting mode over their professional career. In this case, you seem to be doing the opposite to that. You're heading in multiple directions. Why is that?
A lot of artists range over a lot of different subject matters and genres. You know, you've only got to think about people like Diebenkorn, who ranged across pretty much all of the genres in his very long and illustrious career. People like Morandi did the same. You know, although we largely know him as a still life artist, he also did landscapes and portraits. And in fact, there was, you know, a heavy degree of abstraction in the still lifes themselves. So yeah, I think it's very personal. It ranges from artist to artist. And I just think I'm ultimately very curious and want to explore everything.
Returning to the still life works, in a sense, again, the slightly unexpected crops up, for example, with flannelette shirts. There is a chair with red flanny and plug, and green chair and blue flanny. So what's suddenly the attraction of flannelette shirts, for example, as a subject matter?
I can't believe you have to ask what's the attraction of flannies. They're completely glorious objects for a start. I mean, obviously as an artist, the pattern on them is fantastic. You know, I love that. But they're great workwear, you know, right from farmers through to artists. I don't think I know any artists who don't actually own a flanny of some kind. But actually, I mean, I wear flannies a lot. They're fabulous things. They have a kind of a personal resonance for me as well. A couple of years ago, I was going through cancer treatment in the middle of winter, as you know, and I ended up just wearing flanny after flanny because I was so cold all the time. You know, I had no hair and I was just trying to keep warm. So I ended up wearing, you know, 3 flannies at a time, which, you know, I kind of found actually quite intriguing because there are all these multiple patterns on top of each other. So, you know, the flanny is for me intrinsically related or a part of that time in my life as well. And so now, a couple of years down the track, there's something about the discarded flanny on the chair, I suppose, that maybe speaks about a period of time that I hope is behind me.
Symbolism there that you're suggesting at, and there's also some subtle symbolism in a number of the other works where there is a copy of the book Stravinsky's Lunch with the picture of the sock knitter on the front of it in the works Blooms on a Book, and also the work A Woman's Work. Do you think much about the symbolism when you're placing objects into a still life context?
I do, yes. So that book did not just happen there by chance. So the book that we're referring to is a book called Stravinsky's Lunch by a fabulous Australian writer called Drusilla Majeska. And in it, she's investigating the role of creativity, the role of male creativity as opposed to women's creativity, and how essentially most creative people kind of need what I like to refer to as an art slave, someone to do all the jobs and to organize the general logistics of life. And without that, it's really hard to be completely committed and selfish in making one's own work. So that's what the book is about. And so I kind of liked the idea of that. On the cover of the book, there's a picture called The Sock Knitter, a very famous picture by Grace Cossington Smith, again, an Australian female artist. And it talks very much about, what women did. And there's a woman, knitting a pair of socks, presumably for a man who may have gone to war, something like that. So I've kind of used this imagery in this book in the still life by placing a vase over the woman's face, so obscuring her identity, who she is. And yeah, the title, A Woman's Work, asking the question, I guess, what is a woman's work? Is it knitting socks for her partner, her husband? Is it writing books about why women haven't flourished as much in the art world as we might like them to? Yeah, all of these questions.
Speaking of one of the things that you very much seem to like is fish. And there are some glorious fish in these still life works, Gurnard with knife, whiting in colander, and still life with hardy heads. What's the attraction of fish as a frequently used subject matter?
Look, fish are just these wonderful things. They have been used in still life painting forever. And there's a good reason for that, because oil paint describes fish. It's the perfect medium for describing fish. The two just go together so perfectly. I love fish. I love the different kinds of fish. I also love the names. Like, who doesn't love a name? Hardy heads. What a great little name that is for these tiny, gorgeous little fish. So everything about them attracts me.
Well, there's a great deal to discover in this range of work, same, but different. Alison Mackay, thanks for sharing your exhibition with us.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.